This is the second installment of my response to the latest round of King James only propaganda that it's making its rounds through Facebook. I try not to just cover topics that's the topic du jour, whatever's going on right now, because I would like my videos to be relevant whether you watch them now or 10 years from now. I try to stick with things that are eternal principles. But fortunately, these things come around pretty often, so sadly, it'll still be relevant probably 10 years from now because these things are cyclical. A few of our talking points here about King James only. First of all, King James only makes King James the standard, not the original languages. According to King James only reasoning, it is the standard. That is why they use terminology like added to, taken away, changed. What is the implication of that? The implication is King James is original. That Paul, Jesus, and Moses all wrote in King James, and anybody that changes it at all is changing the Bible. That's flawed thinking, because none of them wrote in King James. At the time the New Testament was written, English didn't exist as we know it now or as it was in 1611 when the King James was translated. So all the objections King James only is raised towards modern translations can be turned around on the King James. And we've developed that in the first lesson, so I won't cover too much. But and the question is, if the King James is the standard, which King James is the standard? Because people say, I like this, the 1611, and every site you see commenting on this says 1611. Problem is what people carry with them is the 1769 Blaney edition. So, did the Blaney edition that you're carrying with you, did it change the Bible? Because it's certainly not the 1611. So if 1611 is original, then if you're not using 1611, and I'm not aware of anybody that does, people that preach from the King James don't preach from the 1611. They preach from the Blaney edition. So did that change the Bible? Since it changed from the 1611, is that a change? So how is it that now the 1769 is all of a sudden the one translation to rule them all? See, this thing just disintegrates the more you inspect it. And plus, there is the Oxford edition and the Cambridge edition. They don't agree with each other. So which one of those changed the Bible? Because they don't agree. So if it's the standard, then which one is right? So you're on a shaky foundation already if you take this ideology. But we talked about there's like a meme that's come across Facebook, and then I covered last week. I covered the intro to it and some of the objections raised in the intro. I'm not going to rehash that, but I want to deal with the meat of the meme itself. And I saved this I want to do a standalone message for this because it deals with textual variance. Textual variance is a complex issue. And it kind of puts you at a disadvantage because, like I said last time, the King James only argument that NIV was scratched into existence by the cloven hoof of Satan is way more exciting, way more sensational, especially for people that had Stephen King on their bookshelf and they feel like they have to give it up or whatever. See, that's easy to understand. But problem is easy to understand don't mean truth. The truth is there are textual variants through different manuscripts. So biblical scholars have to go back and compare manuscripts to the best of their ability and try to reconstruct what the original says. Now, I'm going to say this from the outset. No doctrine is affected by these textual variants. Even in the places where a verse is disputed, you'll find the same principle in other places. So There's a guy named Bart Ehrman, and he would take this as a compliment. I'm not slamming him. He feels his whole life goal is to destroy people's faith, and there's two of him. There's the popular level that appears on the Daily Show and late night TV and NPR radio, that cues the scary music and says, oh, there's all these variants in the Bible and we can't even trust the Bible. But then there's the scholarly level one that was cornered in a debate, and they asked him, is there any cardinal doctrine affected by textual variants? And he said no. So, when you're selling books to the general public and you're wanting to get on, Comedy Central, it's good to be sensational. But the truth is, no major doctrine is affected. So I want to say that from the outset. You can get saved reading the King James Bible. You can get saved reading the NIV Bible, because all the cardinal doctrines are not affected by the textual variants. This just gets down to accuracy. So there are primarily two schools or two philosophies concerning manuscripts. Now, this is oversimplified, and there's nuance within this, but just for the sake of this short video, I'm just trying to whet your appetite to study it honestly and not just rely on your tradition. So there's the Alexandrian text type, which is oldest and fewest. Then there's Byzantine text type that is the majority. There's a lot of them, but are much later in date. So I'm going to give you the defense for each side, and I'll let you decide. I'm not trying to get you to decide on which one is the best or whatever. I'm just trying to remove the stigma attached to it that something nefarious is going on whenever there's a change in translation. So first of all, the Alexandrian text. The rule of thumb with the Alexandrian text, I'll use this as an example. I grew up next to the Arkansas River, and a lot of times you would have a big flood. And whenever it flooded, you would see like trees floating down the river and everything else, So say me and my buddy are standing next to the Arkansas River, except rather than standing side by side, I'm here, and he's a few miles up the river from me. Okay? And we have walkie-talkies. And I'm standing there next to the bank of the river, and a tree goes floating by. Well, I radio my friend and say, hey, did you see that tree float by? He said, no, I didn't see no tree float by. So what can I determine from that? That the tree fell in somewhere between me and him. He's up the river. We're gonna, for analogy's sakes, that river represents the timeline, the river of time. Time flows in one direction. Time flows from the past to the future. So he's in the past, I'm in the future. Okay? So the rule of thumb is if you look far enough back in manuscript tradition, and the reason Alexandrian texts are the oldest is because of climate, mainly. Is because that dry desert climate, imagine writing materials lasting for millennia. It takes a dry climate. So that's really why some of the oldest manuscripts are Alexandrian in type, because of climate. So, but the rule of thumb is if you look back far enough in time and the verse doesn't contain something, then possibly someone added it. Because here's the other thing about Greek manuscripts. They were not made by professionals. We had this idea that, later, several centuries later, you would have scriptoriums where, a person would read and you would have a whole room full of people copying them. And that's why you end up with a whole bunch of them that are later, because you had that. But the early church was under persecution. They were running, and they had dim lighting, and so if you wanted a copy of, say, the book of Romans, then you had to copy your own handwritten copy of the book of Romans. So you would borrow your buddy's book of Romans and you'd copy it yourself. Well, just like, and this is the Alexandrian thinking. I'm not defending it or whatever. I'm just saying this is the This is the thought behind the Alexandrian text type. Just like we do in our Bible, we write little notes out to the side and we make notations. Well, according to this reasoning, that sometimes these notations down the line make their way into the text. And that's why you see later manuscripts contains verses that you don't find in the older manuscripts. And also they can tell by the text type that they can date pretty accurately whenever these manuscripts are from. Just like today, if you see the word archaeology and the A and the E are together, it's called a ligature, then they can date that to a certain time, in history, and they know when that document was printed. Well, they didn't have printing then, but this is just an example. So they have ways of determining. And, back in those days, they didn't have these. They didn't have glasses, so some people couldn't see well, and bad lighting, running from the Romans, But, and this is where the Bart Ehrmans of the world will run in and say, see, you just can't trust your Bible at all. Well, Dan Wallace, who's one of my favorite Greek scholars, as an exercise in his class, he made an original document, and he passed it around. He says, and I want you to deliberately, some of you leave stuff off, some of you add stuff, some of you misspell stuff, some whatever. And so he had them do that, and then he tore up the original. And he said, okay, now let's see if we can reconstruct the original based on all of your errant copies that you have. But what he didn't tell him is he really didn't tear it up. And so he took out the original, and this, just students. This wasn't scholars. This is students. These students were able to reconstruct the original from all those copies with different errors in them. So you can reconstruct. We can reconstruct. See, our problem is not that we have a 1,000-piece puzzle with 900 pieces. We have a 1,000-piece puzzle with 1,500 pieces. So we have so many manuscripts. So we have the original Word of God. It's just a matter of scholarship determining what was added, what was taken away, and things like that. That's the Alexandrian school of thought, and most of your modern translations follow that school of thought. It's not nefarious. They're not trying to take away verses. It's how if you look back far enough and the verse is not there, then according to them, and that's not the only criteria, and that's just one of the criteria, so I'm way oversimplifying. Another reason textual variants are a good thing is, the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code says that this smoke-filled room somewhere, all these monks got together and changed the Bible, then there wouldn't be textual variants, because they would have. And also, it's impossible because they're still digging up manuscripts in places, and they're finding manuscripts that, for the most part, agree with other manuscripts. And most of the textual variants are things like punctuation and something that's called a movable nu. You know how we don't say a apple, because that's obnoxious. We say an apple. So we put an N whenever there's a vowel after that letter. Well, it's the same way. That's what the movable nu. Well, some of the people that copy their manuscripts didn't have that didn't put the movable nu in there. It doesn't change the meaning at all. It's just a matter of grammar minutia. But that's the Alexandrian school of thought. Then there is the Byzantine, and honestly, I'm just be totally transparent with you. I was starting to wonder about the Byzantine because I was having trouble finding somebody that defended the position worth a flip, that wasn't a King James only wackerdoodle, because most of the people defending it were doing it from a King James only perspective. But there's a guy named Dr. Maurice Rawlins that he defended the Byzantine majority text. The majority Byzantine majority, according to that school of thought, is because you have more manuscripts to choose from, you can better reconstruct what the original said because you have more. Now, the counter argument, the Alexandrians will say, well, that they can trace a lot of those multiple manuscripts back to one, and they can see where this guy copied from this guy up the line, and then that addition got introduced into the text. I realize this is complex, and even if you can't even follow it, I'll at least hope it puts some humility in you and say, before I speak on this. But here's the thing: if you take the King James only position, you're not dealing with either one of those. You're not dealing with either one of these, because the King James doesn't follow the Byzantine majority. And that's what King James only will try to sleight of hand on you and say that it's the King James follows the Byzantine majority. It follows what's called the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus is when a guy took the King James Bible and constructed a Greek manuscript or a Greek text out of the King James. He reverse engineered. So there are readings in the Textus Receptus that has no manuscript authority whatsoever. A good example, Ephesians 3:9, King James talks about the fellowship of the mystery. It's koinonia. So that's what's in the King James, and that's what's in the Textus Receptus. However, both in the Byzantine, the majority of the text, and the Alexandrian text has oikonomia, or administration. Now you can see how, they're real close together, so somebody just made a mistake copying. So there's an example that the King James doesn't even follow the majority text. Years ago, I started off, I had used the King James Bible, because that's what everybody else used. And, I had somebody give me the audio Bible, and it was Alexander Scourby reading the King James. And I would play it, and I'd run it back and listen and try to sort it out. Well, then I got into youth ministry, and I thought, well, since everybody uses the King James, I'll use the New King James since it's a little easier to read. So, and I didn't want to come at young people with whithersoever the governor listeth. They'd look at you like you grew a horn or something. So I used the New King James. But whenever I made that switch, I would be listening to somebody teach from the Greek, and they would say, yeah, King James says this, but it's really this. And I noticed the New King James was that. And so I originally went to it because just for easier to explain to young people, but then found out that it's a better translation of the same Greek manuscript tradition. What the problem is it's the same manuscript tradition as the King James, which is the Textus Receptus. And I said this before on others, but I'll bring this back out because I want you to know what you're defending when you say somebody changes the Bible. Whenever Erasmus, who made the text that underlies the King James, got to the book of Revelation, he didn't have a manuscript for it. So he borrowed a commentary and extracted a Greek text from a commentary. Then he gets to the last page of the commentary, and the page had fallen off. So he takes the Latin Vulgate, he takes a Latin translation, and he creates a Greek text out of that. So there are readings at the end of Revelation that there is no manuscript authority for whatsoever. And yet, if anybody moves away from that, they are changing the Bible. And that's why I'm saying that the King James will not stand the same scrutiny if you turn it back on it. And I'm not knocking the King James. Now, I want something a little more accurate than that, and that's why I moved to modern translations. The translation I want doesn't exist. I want a translation based on the majority text, but they don't have one yet. It doesn't exist. Let me get to the examples that they use now that we've kind of determined what textual variants are. And this is what the article that was knocking the modern translation, King James. It says, King James, why did Jesus come to earth? Luke 9:56, for the Son of Man has come not to destroy men's lives, but to save them. and he went to another village. The NIV says in 956, they went to another village. Now, the way they framed the question is a little misleading. Jesus is not telling why he came to the earth in this verse. This is the account where the James and John wanted to call down lightning, call down fire from heaven, and nuke the Samaritans. And Jesus says, and that's where the King James says, that the Son of Man didn't come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Now, some of the old manuscripts doesn't have that. So modern translations didn't take it out. It's just in a footnote. So you can see it says some manuscripts say this. So it's not like they removed it. They put it in a footnote because to the best of their ability, if they go back far enough, but the way this article frames it is like they're trying to obscure the reason Jesus came. Jesus is not telling them why he came. He's telling them why he's not nuking the Samaritans. So it's out of context for one thing. So according to their logic, this obscures the reason Jesus came. But no, it doesn't. And here's a better example. Matthew 18:11 says, "For the Son of Man came to save that which is lost." Matthew 18:11 in the NIV, it says it's quote unquote missing. And we've already talked about the fallacy of that argument, but they're saying it's missing, so it doesn't have that. So this is where the King James onlys cry foul and say, see, they're trying to even obscure the reason Jesus came. Well, the thing is, if they were trying to remove it totally from the Bible, why is it in the companion scripture in Luke 19:10? Luke 19:10 says Jesus came to seek and save that which is lost. And this goes back to my point. That doesn't change a major doctrine. And this is, according to the Alexandrian thought, is whenever they were copying that, whenever they in their mind remembered the companion verse in Matthew 18, in Luke 19:10, that Jesus came to seek and save that which is lost, and they wrote it out from muscle memory because they knew the parallel text in another gospel. And could be. I mean, but the fact is it's still in Matthew in a footnote, and it's also in Luke 19:10. So if this was some nefarious attempt to remove that from the Bible, then why is it in the companion verse? So this isn't this is about textual variance. And you can study it, and not all textual variants are the same. There are some that have pretty good backing. And I'll close with this. This is just to prove that there's not an agenda behind this. Dr. Michael Brown, who was part of the Brownsville revival, he is a charismatic. I was listening to a podcast that had, an anti-charismatic perspective and the charismatic perspective. Dr. Brown defended the charismatic perspective. So he is a charismatic. Part of the Brownsville revival. Okay. One textual variant is a longer ending of Mark 16. He doesn't believe that it's original. Now, I'm not saying I agree with him, but I'm saying he doesn't believe it's original. However, Dr. Maurice Rawlins, that I just referenced earlier, is a Baptist theologian, and he believes it exists. Because a lot of people say, well, because it talks about tongues, they're trying to take the tongues out. Well, if they're trying to take the tongues out of the Bible, they did a very poor job, because it's still in Acts 2:4, still in 1 Corinthians 12, Acts chapter 10. It's in all these different verses. So if they were trying to take tongues out of the Bible, they sure did a sorry job of it. So these are textual reasons. It's not about an agenda. And my Bible still has Mark 16. It's still in there. And there's a little tiny note. And if you really push them, a lot of the scholars on that, they'll say it's in another category itself. It has more sure footing than some other ones, And there's discussion to be made on that. But you can't have a discussion if you are demonizing and just accusing people of trying to change the Bible. So this ran a little long, and I know this is involved, but this is what's involved, and I just skimmed the surface of it. So I hope I did this justice, trying to cover in a short video of a very complex subject. But you don't have to worry about it. Get you a translation you can read. Now, Living Bible is not a translation. It's a paraphrase, and I honestly don't care for it at all. I mean, you can't even make it square with original languages at all. It's a paraphrase, you know. And then the Message is like just one step above paraphrase. So, and there are places it's got some good. I like the way it words it, but it says on the dust jacket of the Message, don't use it for your primary study. And I know people that do that, and they preach out of it and everything else when basically it tells you not to. But that's not their fault if you're not going to follow the directions of the people that published the Fraslin thing. So even that, there's nuance in that, you know, and the New Living Translation is a translation. It's a little more free. And so I say, do comparative studies. and watch translations that market themselves as literal. There is no such thing. If it doesn't say heurisco gastroi in gastroi, I'm quoting it from memory, but it's something like that, which is literally Mary was found having in the belly. In other words, it smooths out in English as she was found with a child. So if your translation doesn't say Mary was found having in the belly, it wasn't literal. It's very good marketing, and they make it just janky worded enough to make you think it's literal, because you think, well, this must be how it really reads. Well, they just kind of made it janky worded. And then if it doesn't say in the Old Testament, God has a long nose, that's what the word God has a long temper. That's literally that's the idiom it uses in the Hebrew, is God has a long nose. So if your Bible doesn't say God has a long nose, then it's not literal. Just do comparative studies. Do comparative studies with several translations, and then you'll see the differences, and that'll prompt further study. But don't just use an obscure translation to shore up your doctrine. You got to let the Bible inform you. Let the Bible inform your doctrine, not choose what doctrine you want to preach and then rifle through translations to try to shore up what you wanted to teach to start with. So anyway, I've run really long this time, but it was a complex subject. So thanks for watching. God bless.